When people tell the story of 1870s Chicago, they usually tell it like a triumph. A city built on mud. A city drowning in sewage flooding and filth. A city so ambitious, it literally lifted itself into the air. Buildings raised on jack screws. Streets elevated block by block. An engineering miracle. A young American metropolis forcing order onto a landscape that seemed determined to resist it. That is the story above ground. But below ground, another story was waiting. Because while Chicago celebrated its rising streets, workers digging beneath the old grade may have uncovered something the official narrative was never prepared to explain. Not just muddy foundations, not just debris from a rough frontier town, but buried structures, preserved architecture, hidden passages, entire layers of construction that did not behave like the remains of a city barely old enough to have a past. And the deeper they went, the less it looked like Chicago had simply grown, the more it looked like something had been covered. The street elevation projects of the 1850s through the 1870s are remembered as one of the great feats of early American engineering. Chicago had a problem that was impossible to ignore. The land was low, wet, unstable. Waste did not drain. Streets dissolved into mud. Disease followed stagnant water. If the city wanted a future, it had to rise above the ground it stood on. So they did the unthinkable. They raised the roads. They raised the sidewalks. They raised entire buildings, if necessary. They created a new street level that could finally support sewers drainage and a modern urban future. On paper, it was practical. But projects like that do something dangerous. They force a city to expose itself. They peel back the visible surface and open the layers beneath. And once Chicago began opening the ground at scale, workers found more than mud. They found buried architecture. At first, the discoveries were easy to dismiss. Old foundations, perhaps. Settler-era cellars, remnants of poorly planned early construction swallowed by the city's own rapid development. That was the simplest explanation, and for a while, it was the one engineers preferred. But the discoveries kept repeating. Workers excavating beneath the old street level encountered walls and facades too deeply buried to fit comfortably within the accepted timeline. Window frames appeared where there should have been only fill. Doorways emerged below the line of the visible city. Masonry surfaced at depths that suggested not gradual sinking, but prior occupation. In some places, lower stories of buildings now sat beneath the new grade, as if Chicago had been lifted over them, leaving an older urban layer intact below. And some of those buried spaces were preserved with a completeness that is difficult to ignore. Not collapsed ruins, not rotted fragments, not the random remains of hasty frontier construction, but rooms, storefronts, stone foundations cut with unusual precision. Brickwork that looked less improvised than inherited. Architectural details that felt permanent, deliberate, urban. That is where the official story begins to fray. Because Chicago's accepted origin story is a story of speed. A raw settlement becoming a major city almost overnight. Rough construction. Mud timber haste. A place too young, too unstable, and too chaotic to have left behind the kind of buried sophistication some of these excavations seem to reveal. And yet the surviving photographs suggest exactly that. In those grainy images developed while the city celebrated progress, workers stand beside structures that look far too complete to be dismissed as incidental remains. Buried facades rise from the mud. Doorways remain framed. Openings line up. Walls hold. In some scenes, lower levels appear not destroyed, but entombed sealed beneath the later grade, as though an older Chicago had been overtaken and then built over. Publicly, these finds were minimized. In reports, the language softened. Old construction, prior grade level, earlier improvements. Existing remains. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth lingering over. But the repetition of those phrases tells its own story. Because if these buried structures were ordinary, why do they feel so strangely absent from the triumphal narrative of Chicago's rebirth? Why are they rarely centered in the story of the street raising itself? Why do they appear more clearly in photographs than in explanation? Sometimes the silence around a discovery says more than the discovery itself. And beneath Chicago, the first real anomaly was not simply what was found. It was how consistently it was found. Uniformity. As excavation expanded across the downtown district, workers encountered buried structures at roughly similar depths, on different streets, in different blocks, in areas supposedly shaped by different owners, different dates, different patterns of development. And yet, again and again, the old architectural layer appeared under a relatively consistent blanket of fill. That is not what gradual accumulation usually looks like. Natural buildup is messy, uneven, chaotic. One block rises faster than another. One structure is altered, another demolished, a third rebuilt. But beneath Chicago, the pattern could feel unnervingly level, as if the old district had not slowly disappeared into mud, but had been overtaken beneath a more uniform layer. Storefronts aligned from one block to the next. Door heights made sense in relation to one another. Foundations appeared where one would expect a functioning urban district, not isolated frontier improvisations. The old level was not random. It felt organized. And once you begin to notice organization, the question changes. This is no longer just a story about old buildings beneath new streets. It becomes a story about whether Chicago was built over a prior layer far more coherent than the official timeline would suggest. The engineering teams themselves were not using the language people use today. They were not talking about hidden civilizations or erased empires. They were trying to solve practical problems. But private notes scattered descriptions, and the logic of the excavation seemed to point toward a growing discomfort, because the remains below did not always look temporary. Some foundations were deeper and more substantial than one would expect in unstable marshland if the structures above them were meant to be brief. Some walls carried the visual authority of permanence. Stone lintels, decorative brick courses, facades laid out with symmetry and intention. This was not the aesthetic grammar of desperate improvisation. It looked like a city that expected to last. That alone would be remarkable. But then came the preservation. One of the most unsettling aspects of the buried structures was not simply that they existed, but that some appeared to have been sealed rather than slowly abandoned. Lower spaces preserved in mud, interiors protected from weathering, door hardware still visible, windows surviving in conditions that do not easily match a narrative of gradual exposure, slow decay, and routine demolition. The impression, at least in surviving accounts, is not always of a district that died naturally. Sometimes it feels more like a district interrupted, as if parts of the city had been overtaken quickly, then left beneath a new surface. That does not prove a single catastrophic event. It does not prove one dramatic moment of destruction. But it raises a question that is difficult to dismiss. Why do some of these spaces look less like forgotten remnants and more like sealed environments? Why do they appear preserved by burial rather than erased by time? And that question becomes even more unsettling when paired with what workers reportedly found between the buried structures themselves. passages, connections, below-grade corridors, infrastructure that seemed to predate the official systems later associated with the city. Chicago's well-known freight tunnels belong in the standard narrative to the 1890s and after. But during the earlier street elevation, work crews appear to have encountered older subsurface passages connecting buildings beneath the existing street-level corridors that made little sense if everything below belonged merely to a primitive settlement improvising on unstable ground. Some were narrow, some were larger. Some appeared to include drainage features or ventilation logic. Some looked less like accident and more like planning. And planning is precisely the problem, because a frontier outpost can be messy. A boomtown can be hasty. But once buried storefronts, aligned foundations, consistent grade relationships, and pre-existing subterranean passages start appearing together, the image changes. What emerges is not a handful of isolated curiosities. It begins to resemble an older urban layer, a system, a district, perhaps even a city beneath the city. This is where the official explanation retreats toward convenience. Poor drainage, constant mud, repeated filling, rapid growth, streets endlessly built up to keep pace with a wet landscape. And certainly some of that is true. Chicago did struggle with low ground and terrible sanitation. Fill was used, streets were raised, grades changed. But explanation is not the same thing as full accounting. Because what troubles observers looking back is not merely that fill existed, it is the character of that fill. In some areas, workers found debris consistent with demolition and urban accumulation. In others, however, the fill appears denser, cleaner, more controlled, almost placed, rather than merely formed. Packed layers that suggest intent. Coverage that feels systematic. A rising grade that in practical terms solved an engineering problem, but in historical terms may also have concealed an older surface with extraordinary efficiency. That possibility lingers over the entire project. Was the city simply adapting, or was it also knowingly or not sealing away evidence that no longer fit the story of its own beginning? As the excavations progressed, the documentary pattern appears to shift. Early observations could be more descriptive, more open, more willing to note buried remains. But over time, the language narrows. Reports become cleaner, more focused on the success of the new grade, the new sewers, the modern city taking shape above. The buried structures remain below that narrative present, but increasingly flattened into technical terms. And photographs, those strange survivors of transitional moments, take on an outsized importance. Because where written descriptions turn vague images, hold their ground. In them, the old city is not entirely gone. You can still see the geometry of windows beneath the new line. You can still see wall faces disappearing into packed earth. You can still see that what was being built above was not always beginning from nothing. It was rising over something already there, something substantial enough to trouble the myth of absolute newness. And then there is the question of what was preserved, what was buried again, and how quickly those decisions were made. Again and again, the most complete spaces seem to vanish back beneath foundations and fill. The most intact buried storefronts are documented briefly, then lost beneath the momentum of progress. Sections where the architecture appeared most refined were not turned into celebrated discoveries. They were passed over, recovered, incorporated into the practical logic of the new city above. Officially, that makes sense. The project was expensive, time-sensitive, driven by civic urgency. Chicago was not conducting archaeology, It was constructing survival. But practicality can still leave a pattern, and the pattern is difficult to miss. The more coherent the buried remains, the faster they seem to disappear from view. The more the underground layer suggests permanence planning or prior sophistication, the less it seems to belong in the public story. That does not require an explicit conspiracy. It only requires a city more interested in becoming modern than in interrogating what lay beneath its feet. Sometimes suppression is not dramatic. Sometimes it looks like efficiency. Sometimes it looks like a deadline. Sometimes it looks like a decision not to ask the wrong question, because the entire future of the city depends on moving forward. But forward movement can still become a form of burial. By the completion of the major street-raising works, Chicago had succeeded in remaking itself. The old muddy grade had been overcome. Sidewalks and roadways rose. Buildings adapted. The city stood taller, cleaner, more capable of supporting the urban machine it was becoming. And below all of that, another Chicago remained. Fragmented, dark, partly visible in photographs, partly suggested in notes, partly implied by what was no longer discussed. A buried district of foundations, lower stories, preserved storefronts, passages, and architectural details that did not sit comfortably inside the official chronology. And that is where the real unease begins. Because if the buried remains beneath downtown Chicago were merely the predictable leftovers of a city rapidly changing its grade, then one would expect them to reinforce the standard story. One would expect them to look rough, temporary, transitional, exactly what a young frontier city should leave behind. But many of the surviving glimpses suggest something more settled, more ordered, more urban, as if what lay below the new streets was not simply the crude first draft of Chicago, but evidence of an earlier maturity the public narrative never quite knew what to do with. What if the city did not rise as cleanly from mud as we are told? What if it inherited more than it created? What if the street raising was not only an engineering achievement, but also the final act in covering a pre-existing layer, too complete, too organized, and too inconvenient to fit the myth of instant emergence? That possibility is what gives the story its power. Not certainty, not proof in the absolute sense, but pressure. Pressure exerted by the photographs, pressure exerted by alignment, pressure exerted by preservation, pressure exerted by the strange uniformity of burial and the silence that follows discovery. And once you let that pressure build, Chicago begins to look less like an exception and more like a clue. Because cities do not simply grow upward, they accumulate downward. They overwrite themselves. They absorb, bury, seal, and rename. Streets become roofs. Basements become first floors. Foundations become walls of forgotten rooms. What one generation calls progress, another may later mistake for origin. And somewhere between those two lies the missing layer, the one that still troubles the edge of the record. If Chicago's buried district was more than accidental residue, if it represented a more complete earlier urban environment, then the implications move far beyond one city. They touch the larger pattern visible in old-world capitals, in buried lower levels, in sealed arcades and facades whose first floors have vanished beneath modern grade, in tunnels and forgotten passages, in architectural forms that seem older than the stories assigned to them. Then Chicago is not just a local mystery. It is part of a larger question. How many modern cities stand on buried continuity rather than clean beginnings? How many official timelines simplify what the ground itself would complicate? How many urban surfaces we walk across every day are really lids? Lids over older plans, older streets, older rooms, older memory. The street raising of Chicago is supposed to symbolize a city refusing to sink. But what if beneath that triumph there was another truth? What if the streets were not only raised above mud, but above evidence? Evidence that downtown Chicago contained an older, more complete urban layer than anyone wanted to center in the story of American progress. Evidence that lower stories were not simply inconvenient remnants, but the visible tops of something more coherent beneath. Evidence that tunnels' foundations and preserved spaces belonged not to random chaos, but to an underlying order. And if that order once existed, then perhaps what vanished beneath Chicago did not vanish naturally. Perhaps it was simply built over, systematically, efficiently, permanently. The surviving images feel almost like accidental witnesses. They show enough to disturb the timeline, but not enough to settle it. They offer facades without full context rooms, without total maps, fragments of alignment, without the complete plan. They are like torn pages from a larger record, one whose most important chapters never made it into the official archive. And maybe that is why the story still matters. Because in the end, the mystery is not just what workers found, it is what the city chose to become in response. Chicago could have treated what lay beneath as part of its identity. It could have documented the buried layer in full preserved. It explained it, integrated it into the mythology of the modern city. Instead, the dominant narrative rose with the streets themselves, a young city mastering nature, solving sanitation, and building a future from near nothing. A powerful story, but perhaps too clean, too vertical, too sudden, too eager to begin at the point of emergence rather than the point of inheritance. And so the buried city remained below, not fully denied, but never fully admitted, not erased from existence, but removed from significance. That is often how uncomfortable history survives, not in monuments, not in textbooks, but in thresholds, in grade changes, in sealed windows beneath sidewalks, in half-visible walls, in lower levels no one was meant to linger in for too long. For one brief moment during the street-raising era, Chicago opened itself. The ground was cut back. The old line appeared. Workers looked down into spaces that should not have felt so complete. A deeper city stared back, muted, preserved, and strangely composed beneath the one struggling to define itself above. Then the work continued. Foundations went in. Streets rose. The old level disappeared again. And what had been exposed became something more dangerous than ruin. It became implication. Because if modern Chicago rests on a buried layer, more sophisticated than its origin story allows, then the question is not simply what happened there in the 1870s. The question is how many cities have done the same thing? How many have sealed earlier realities beneath official beginnings? How many have mistaken burial for development? How many have called concealment progress because progress was easier to celebrate than memory? Maybe the old Chicago beneath the streets was nothing more than a forgotten stage of rapid urban adaptation. Or maybe it was a glimpse of something longer, stranger, more established. A city whose lower world survived just long enough to be seen, then vanished beneath the practical triumph of the new. Either way, the pattern remains. Buried facades, uniform depth, preserved storefronts, passages below grade, architecture too finished to feel temporary, documentation that thins as the implications deepen. And once you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to walk through a city without wondering what else has been left beneath you. Not destroyed, not gone, just covered, just renamed, just absorbed into the official surface until the deeper layer became almost impossible to imagine. Almost. Because sometimes the ground opens. Sometimes a city reveals by accident the part of itself it was never supposed to keep visible. And when that happens, history does not always speak clearly. Sometimes it whispers through brick lines under sidewalks, through buried windows, through corridors in darkness, through photographs no one thought would matter later. The streets of Chicago were raised so the city could move forward. But perhaps in the process, something older was pressed into silence. Not dead, not entirely lost, just waiting beneath the weight of the story built above it. And that may be the most unsettling possibility of all. That the real Chicago did not begin where we are told it began. That beneath the streets, beneath the foundations, beneath the official rise of the city, another map still exists. A lower map, a buried map. A map of doors, rooms, passages, and facades that belong to a version of the city we were never meant to inherit as memory, only as foundation. If this stayed with you, there are more cities where the ground may be hiding far more than history admits.